said at various times throughout Christian history that the sacrifice of Jesus is offered either to the devil, on the one hand, because the devil has become the prince of this world. By man cooperating with the devil, man has become the slave of the devil. And so and has certain rights over the fallen humanity, he keeps humanity imprisoned in death. And so in order to liberate man from the devil, Jesus offers himself as a sacrifice to the devil. There are also those who say, and this is more common, that Jesus offers himself as a sacrifice in repayment to God the Father, whose anger against the human race must be satisfied. And it is that I wish to address right now, because that understanding and the effects that proceed from it, I believe, are one of the most crucial differences between Orthodox Christianity and non-Orthodox Christianity. The realization of what that means, the ramifications of it, because we emphatically say that the sacrifice that Christ offers himself obediently to the Father, yes, of course, but not as any sort of satisfaction payment to the Father who demands satisfaction because of the sins of the human race. Now, let me enlarge on that a little bit. This idea is based on the understanding, it comes from various sources, but mainly from the Middle Ages, that it's understanding the relationship of God and the human beings in terms of a legal contract. And that God, it begins with the premise that God is infinite. God is immeasurable. Therefore, when the human being sins against God, God is immeasurably offended. You cannot in any way measure God, who is perfect goodness, how much that goodness is offended by sin. God, this argument goes on to say, is just. And his justice is spoken as something that operates almost independently from his mercy. And God's justice must be satisfied. In other words, somebody must be punished for the sins of the human race. Because there is no human being capable of being infinitely punished by God for the sins of the human race, because we are limited and God is infinite, God sends his own Son, who is infinite, and punishes him in our place. And so, by that punishment inflicted on Christ by his Father, finally, the justice of God is satisfied and his anger is turned away. I want to read to you a little passage. If you're reading Father Hopko's book, Doctrine, maybe you've read this already. Writing of St. Gregory the Theologian about this question. It sums up very clearly what we teach. Now we are to examine another fact and dogma, which in my judgment is very necessary to inquire into. To whom was that blood offered that was shed for us? And why was it shed? I mean the precious and famous blood of our God and High Priest and sacrifice. We were detained in bondage by the evil one, sold under sin, and receiving pleasure in exchange for wickedness. Now, since a ransom belongs only to him who holds in bondage. Now, think about that. Christ pays the ransom to whomever or whatever holds the human race in bondage. You see, you pay the price to free the slave to the one who owns the slave. I ask then, to whom was this offered and for what cause? If it was offered to the evil one, what an outrage to say such a thing. If the robber receives ransom, not only from God, but a ransom which consists of God himself, and has such an illustrious payment for his tyranny, then it would have been right for him to have left us alone altogether. That is to say that the devil is a creature. Whatever tyranny he holds over the human race, and death is his greatest tool, is the tyranny of the creature. It would be an outrage for a ransom which consists of God himself to be given to the devil. It would be treating the devil as if he were greater than a creature. Then he goes on to say, but if it was offered to God the Father, I ask first, how? For it was not by God the Father that we were being oppressed. It was not God the Father who was holding us in bondage. God the Father is not the slave master. And next, on what principle did the blood of his only begotten Son delight the Father, who would not receive even Isaac when he was being sacrificed by his father Abraham, but changed the sacrifice by putting a ram in the place of the human victim? Is it not evident that the Father accepts him, but neither asked for him, that is, neither asked for the sacrifice nor demanded it, but on account of the incarnation, and because humanity must be sanctified by the humanity of God, voluntarily, that he might deliver us himself and overcome the tyrant, and draw us to himself by the mediation of his Son, who also arranged this to the honor of the Father, whom, it is clear, he obeys in all things. So, if the sacrifice is not offered to the devil, and if the sacrifice is not offered to God the Father as a satisfaction to turn away his wrath, but rather is a voluntary offering of obedience of the Son, not demanded by the Father, rather, it is spoken of that God the Father is the one who so loves the world that he gives his only begotten Son. God the Father participates in the offering of the sacrifice of the Son. God the Father is the one who is imaged in the story about the prodigal son in the Gospel of St. Luke as the one who kills the fatted calf. You see, that's an image of God the Father freely giving out of love, out of mercy, his Son. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. How familiar that verse is. But that is exactly the opposite of saying that God demands for the satisfaction of his justice a perfect being to punish in his wrath. It is not the wrath of God that endures forever. It is the mercy of God that endures forever. It is not the justice of God that operates independently of his mercy. The justice and the wrath of God are manifestations in time of his mercy. I had see if I can find it because my page got turned. The mercy of God is consistently expressed throughout the entire Old Testament, even in the midst of expressions of God's wrath when his people are unfaithful. We are even told something that we don't say so much these days, but it's said very freely in the Bible, that God is grieved to his heart because of the sinfulness of the human creatures. God says, "My people, what have I done to you? And how have I wearied you? Answer me. I have reared and brought up children, but they have rebelled against me." But he says, "How can I give you up? How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my fierce anger." Even in the most, you could say, blood-curdling threats that are made in the Old Testament, such as what's described in the end of the book of Deuteronomy, as to what's going to happen to the chosen people if they are unfaithful, they always end with the promise of God's mercy. In all of the words of the prophets, where the people are warned what's going to happen. Jerusalem is going to be overthrown. The people are going to be in exile. They're going to lose the temple. They're going to lose all the outward signs of God's favor. But always, in the end, in every single one of the prophets, the promise is given of His mercy. So, for the Orthodox understanding and experience of God, God is the merciful one who does everything possible, the ultimate act of sending His only begotten Son, who freely offers Himself out of love as the perfect sacrifice. And so how are we going to answer that question? To whom or to what is it offered? The answer is best expressed in this great liturgy of the Church that, if you haven't been to it yet, we do it 10 times a year, called the Liturgy of St Basil. In the prayer, at the center of the liturgy there, the statement is made that He gave Himself up as a ransom to death, in which we were held captive, sold under sin. The sacrifice of Christ is not made to a who. It's made to a what. Christ offers Himself up in sacrifice to the condition that fallen man has become imprisoned in. That man has become cursed and sinful and dead, and so Christ, who is the blessing and sinless and life, offers Himself up freely so that what is His can become available to the human race whom He loves. And in that, the price is paid, and the reconciliation and the atonement are made possible. So, this whole thing of the satisfaction of the angry Father, which so influences so many people's understanding of who God is, it's something that anyone who grows in the life of the Orthodox Church eventually transcends. It's necessary to transcend it. That because otherwise one remains forever imprisoned in this legal battle between God and the human race. And people ask, well, if Jesus paid the debt that I could not pay and paid the price for my sins and made it possible for me to be forgiven, why do I have to then engage in this whole life of ascetic struggle that the Church gives to me? If Jesus did everything for me that way, why do I have to do that? Because it's far more than a legal exchange. Jesus makes it possible for the redemption, for the communion between God and man to be restored. That is what redemption is. Salvation in its entirety is the actual restoring of that communion in the life of each person who is a member of His body in His church. So what Jesus makes possible through His redemptive sacrifice, when it is actually realized in the life of each person in the church, that is salvation. And it requires cooperation and the desire until the end of life to model oneself after the image of Christ, who offers Himself as the perfect sacrifice of love in sacrificial love. It's not just having some sort of anger turned away, having some sort of debt paid, and then I don't have to do anything. When we talk about what does it mean to be justified, how are we justified? How is the righteousness of God imputed to us? The Epistle to the Romans talks so much about that. Is it by faith? Is it by work? Strictly speaking, it's by neither. By Christ. We are not justified by an act of faith. An act of faith, after all, is just another good work, is it not? We are justified by Christ Himself, who dies for us, who rises for us, in whose death and resurrection communion with the Father has been restored. And as our faith becomes His faith, as our life becomes His life, as we, the Christian, each Christian is a miniature Christ, grows in the image of the one Lord, then salvation is realized. And then justification bears its fruit. So, it's not ever a question of reducing reducing redemption to making a profession of faith, reducing salvation to doing this or doing that. Salvation, justification, is made possible by receiving from Christ, who makes it possible, communion with God the Father through his death and resurrection, and then the actual attaining of that communion, following the commandment of the gospel that we must be perfect as the Father in heaven is perfect. The third aspect of salvation is that Christ destroys death by or through his death. That, as we said last week when speaking of the incarnation, it would not be possible for communion between the Father, between the Holy Trinity and the human race, to be restored as long as death had power over the human race. That where death is, God is not. So therefore, Jesus destroys the power of death over the human beings, not from outside, but by getting inside, by dying himself. And by dying himself, death is emptied out. We sing on Good Friday night when we have the service that makes us partake of this passing of Christ into death. Such hymns as, "O life, how can you die? How can you dwell in the tomb? By your death you have destroyed the power of death and raised all the dead from their tombs." And then this verse that I always mention when we speak of this destruction of death, talks about how death has greedily swallowed up every member of the human race from the first parents on. And every time another human being enters death, the devil and death itself, which is often spoken of as a personified force symbolically, its appetite is being more and more satisfied. And when Christ, whom the devil can never quite figure out completely, he wonders about him, just as he wondered about him in the temptation, if you are the Son of God. When Christ, who has done so many great things, such great miracles, teaching what he teaches, when he dies, death really thinks that he's gotten the greatest prize so far. But instead, what happens in the hymns of the church is death finally takes within itself something that's bigger than itself, someone that is more powerful than itself. And the image that's used is a very physical one, that he gets a great stomachache, death does, and vomits out everybody that he's held captive. When devouring Hades engulfed the rock of life, in great pain he burst asunder, and the dead held captive from all ages were released. Jesus transforms death from being the state of alienation between God and man to the means by which, through his own death, we are united to God. So death, that is the curse over the human race that keeps man from communion with God, because God himself goes into it from the inside, trampling down death by death, we say. Death becomes the means of life through the death of Jesus. Just as suffering, the question of Job in the Old Testament. Why is there suffering? It's the question that human beings ask the most. Why do the innocent suffer? It's bad enough when the guilty do, but why do the innocent suffer? The only answer to it is found in the suffering of him who is truly and perfectly innocent. That God's answer to the suffering of the world is to come himself and to take upon himself the suffering and death of humanity. And he who is more innocent than the one-day-old child suffers and dies. And in that suffering and death, he consecrates suffering and death. He makes it into a holy thing That is the uniqueness of Christianity, my friends. It is not found anywhere else in any other human system of philosophy or religion. That suffering is holy. That death is blessed by God. That in Christ, if you suffer and die, you are brought to his life, because that is the way that he is brought to life. That is how he destroys the power of suffering and death over mankind, not by some explosive divine act from the outside, but in his humility, through love, in that extreme charity of his condescension, gets into it, gets himself. We have a God, not like the gods of the Oriental systems of religion, or the remote God of Islam, or the imaginary gods of the pagans. We have a God who gets himself very, very dirty, voluntarily, who partakes of every consequence of the fallen human existence without personal guilt for sin, but who identifies himself with not simply sin, but with the last enemy to be destroyed, which is death. And he makes suffering and death into the path to him, the path to holiness. That's why the center of the Christian faith remains the cross, like we're going to say next week when we speak about the resurrection. That Easter Sunday does not cancel out Good Friday. That the resurrection does not make the crucifixion to disappear. But the two of them remain together. The risen Lord remains the crucified Lord from all eternity. The crucifixion is not some sort of unfortunate tragedy that happened to Jesus because of wicked and evil people, but like a bad dream goes away in 3 days, on the third day. That the crucified one remains, and we're going to speak of how this is so another time, remains in a mystical sense, crucified and risen simultaneously until the end of the world. St. Paul said that he desired to preach no one but Jesus Christ and him crucified. And finally, salvation that has been made possible through Christ's voluntary sacrifice makes possible the deification of man. That the words of St. Athanasius, that God became man so that man might become God, are fulfilled in what Christ makes possible. That the destiny of the human being is to share the life of God himself, to be by grace what God is by nature, not to be an independent God, not to be someone who kind of dissolves into the divine life, like Buddhism or New Age cults imagine, but that the creature always remains the creature. The creator always remains the creator. They are always distinct. But the life of the creator, it is the will for the creator, of the creator, that the human creature share his same life, that image and likeness that he breathed into us in the beginning, that were to lead us to eternal communion with him, made possible by the sacrifice of Christ for us, that in him the wall that divides God and man is broken down, and man is married once again to God in Christ, and has possible, available, in this saving act, in which everything is forgiven. It is the doctrine of the Orthodox Church that by this perfect offering of Christ, everything is forgiven. All that remains is for each person for whom this forgiveness is offered to accept it and to realize it. And again, the acceptance is not simply an isolated act, but is an ongoing process of acceptance. But it is available for everyone. So in it, truth is made available. Redemption from sin and death is made available. Suffering and death are transformed into the means to life. And what life? The life of God. So with that, we'll close for this evening.
This is the end of side 1. Please turn this cassette over for the continuation of the message on side 2.